this webinar. I'm Indu Murthy, the Sector Head for Climate, Environment and Sustainability at CSTEP. Before we get into the panel discussion and the other things, some housekeeping announcements. Audience, please keep your mics muted. Post your questions in the chat window or the Q&A box, and they will be answered either on chat or will be posted to the panel during the Q&A session, which we will have towards the end. India submitted its long-term low-carbon development strategy, also called the LTLEDS, to the UNFCCC at COP27 recently, which is in compliance with the mandates of the Paris Agreement. The strategy lays out the context in which India will transition to net zero. Insights from modeling studies can definitely help design a comprehensive strategy for each of the sectors and determine the system-wide trade-offs that would have to be addressed before actually implementing this particular strategy. CSTEP's work on modeling net zero scenarios for India has thrown up some very interesting questions and consideration. These questions were highlighted in our recent report, No Silver Bullet, Essays on India's Net Zero Transition. Some of these questions include estimation techniques to project future demand, behavioral changes that are conducive to net zero, decarbonization of the power sector, which looks beyond the renewables, industrial decarbonization strategies, which have, again, should be looking at things other than electrification, and carbon pricing for economic systems transformation. We will be presenting the findings of this study today and discussing them with an excellent panel we have on board. But first, we will hear from one of the architects of India's LTLEDS, that is the low carbon, low emission development strategy, Ms. Richa Sharma, the Additional Secretary, MOEFCC. Ms. Sharma was part of the delegation that presented this strategy at COP27. Ms. Richa Sharma had agreed to grace this occasion, but had to be at a parliament session during this time. So therefore, she won't be joining us in person, but that said, she has recorded her thoughts on the formulation of India's LTLEDS and the relevance of modeling studies in developing net zero strategies for India. Can we have Ms. Sharma's recorded thoughts and speech here, please?
Namaste to everybody joining today's event organized by CSTEP for discussions on climate modeling in the context of their recent report titled No Silver Bullet, containing essays on India's net zero transition. I thank CSTEP for this opportunity to share my thoughts on the role of climate modeling in constructing pathways for a net zero future for India. The mitigation goal of the Paris Agreement requires a rapid global low carbon transition. IPCC reports that emissions need to fall 43% over 2019 levels by 2030. In practical terms, achieving the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement requires that key emitting sectors of the global economy must transform significantly and rapidly towards low carbon systems and eventually decarbonize as feasible. The mitigation goal, however, has to be seen in conjunction with global sustainable development goals. Developing countries still have development deficits that need to be bridged, and there are significant costs associated with a rapid green turn in the short to medium term. Many of the technologies for hard to abate sectors are not available or affordable for developing economies, and there are other challenges associated with low-cost renewable energy such as intermittency, the need for affordable utility-scale battery storage, grid modernization, and so on. Therefore, countries like India are faced with the challenge of ensuring growth, income, and jobs, while also grappling with climate change and steering low-carbon transition of the economy. Climate modelers who are working on constructing scenarios and pathways for India need to grapple with many uncertainties and assumptions. These pertain not only to GDP growth, tech innovations in the future and associated emissions, but also about the saturation levels in material demand in steel and cement at specific income levels, as brought out in the CSTEP report, about levels of energy consumption, efficiency gains, extent of electrification of end-use sectors. It is indeed extremely important that assumptions and the uncertainties underlying these climate models be made explicit. When assumptions are transparent, we can see what kind of possible futures the models are projecting for India. India's contribution to historical emissions is negligible. The IPCC report clearly shows that the contribution of all of South Asia, which is home to about 25% of humanity today, to the historical cumulative emissions between 1850 and 2019 is only 4%. As a developing country, India has overriding developmental priorities. Poverty eradication is a basic minimum goal. We have to go much beyond this and ensure universal well-being of our people. The links between per capita energy use and GDP are well known, and energy use in India has to increase significantly even with efficiency gains. So clearly, climate models that artificially constrain energy and material use in India in pursuit of global temperature goals would be questionable. India also has to build resilience to the impacts of climate change. We have communities, settlements, and ecosystems that are highly vulnerable, and protecting them and ensuring that they have the capacity to cope with increasingly variable weather and climate conditions is our main priority. Nevertheless, being cognizant of its role in the world, India has been at the forefront of setting ambitious mitigation targets and ensuring that these are met. There is no doubt that India is punching far above its weight on the mitigation front already. However, we have to understand this as an additional effort. Unfortunately, many modeling studies subsume India's efforts over the last decade into the baseline and further allocate additional mitigation burdens to India. On the other hand, globally, there is no accounting of the developed countries not having met their pre-2020 commitments. It is my understanding that all models that we see start from the latest base year and project forward, thus washing away all of history, let alone starting from 1850 onwards. Even the inaction of the developed countries from onwards is not taken into consideration. We do need models that account for historical inequality. This is the way in which we can build equitable futures. If we begin from erasing all historical inequality, then our chances of projecting equitable futures and achieving them in reality both become difficult. Now, getting into the specifics of modeling, I believe that short-term forecasting models have been used widely in India in the context of planning, in the such as during the 5-year plans at the economy-wide as well as at the sectoral level. Now, models that deal with longer time horizons, on the other hand, have assumed importance in the context of climate change. Long-term goals for emission reductions that are set at the global level transcend the shorter planning horizons of the individual countries. Now, uncertainties introduced by assumptions in prices, technology, and growth increase exponentially in such long-term models, and their use for policy-making purposes must be subject to a thorough scrutiny of these uncertainties and assumptions. And this is, in fact, what the essays in the book, in the report brought out by CSTEP actually does address. Now, the basis for the immediate, short-term, and long-term policy relevance of models has to be clearly stated. What actionable results do these models provide? Now, India's NDCs are relatively short-term as compared to its long-term goal of achieving net zero by 2070. Now, for the short term, these models may provide important insights into potential sectoral strategies. In the long term, the policy relevance of these models needs to be demonstrated with clear and feasible outcomes. Modeling results at the global level have been discussed most recently in the IPCC AR6 reports. This report relies heavily on global model scenarios. The temperature goals of the Paris Agreement are obviously global and depend on global emissions. These global emissions, however, are an aggregate of regional and national emissions pathways. Recent studies have shown that the regional outcomes that underlie these global emission pathways are highly unequal across all variables, whether macroeconomic, energy, and emissions. Now, these global models have a series of assumptions that project the continuation of the start inequality between the developed and the developing countries that exists today well into the future. Now, these models do not consider and operationalize the principles of equity and CBDR and RC that are foundational to the UNFCCC. As stated earlier, the lack of accounting of historical emissions is a problem across modeling results. As a result, the sectoral strategies that are prescribed by such models as requirements for a 1.5-degree or a 2-degree world are based on highly unequal outcomes at the regional level that do severely constrain growth and development in the developing countries, particularly in South Asia and Africa. In India, we must build global models that foreground the principles of equity and CBDRRC and construct alternative scenarios for global mitigation. Unlike the global models built by developed countries, we must begin our analysis from an accounting of the historical emissions and the lack of pre-2020 ambition and action by the developed countries. I make this point to emphasize not only that we must look at what India can do through the modeling studies, but we must also look at global mitigation, and India's contribution must be linked and assessed in this context. Now, you're aware that India has submitted its long-term strategy in the form of its first LT-LEDS to the UNFCCC at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. And India's approach in the LT-LEDS is in keeping with the best available science and the principles of global equity and climate justice. Now, India's approach to meet its developmental goals while keeping well within its fair share of carbon budget, unlike developed countries that have far exceeded their fair share. So India has set ambitious targets and made concerted efforts at implementing actions on ground to meet these targets. India has updated its NDCs because our actions so far have ensured that we are well on track to achieve and even surpass our first NDC targets. But this has not been easy. India is paying significant costs for mitigation that should be compensated for by developed countries by way of climate finance. Studies that the renewable energy rich southern states are paying higher costs than they otherwise would have because of the much higher absorption costs of high cost renewable energy. In addition to this, India has to build resilience and ensure that we have the capacities to adapt to climate change and recover from loss and damage resulting from the impacts of anthropogenic global warming, which we have not caused. While it is difficult to incorporate all this into modeling studies, this is a challenge that Indian scientists and researchers must undertake. Can we build models that foreground our national and development priorities while also speaking to just and equitable contributions to the global effort to limit global warming? Can we challenge the trend of building only forward-looking models and incorporate the historical inequities also into our analysis? This is a question that we must ask and attempt to answer. Current global models and the modeling frameworks will not answer these questions for us. That is the task before the Indian researchers. Thank you, and I end by congratulating CSTEP on the release of their recent report that addressed important issues in climate modeling. Thank you.
That was quite insightful, I would say. And thanks, Ms. Sharma, in your absence. But I would definitely like to place my thanks to you for bringing in extremely important points into this conversation, which include issues of equity, the need for considering historical emissions when doing the modeling, challenges in the transition, which include issues related to the cost, technological challenges, and so on and so forth. So moving on, we will now have researchers from CSTEP, Ms. Kaveri and Kritika, who would bring in key insights from the report that was alluded to by Ms. Sharma. That's the no silver bullet consideration for India's net zero strategy. Audience, through the course of the presentation, please do post your questions in the Q&A chat box as you are listening in, and we would be taking it up towards the end. Over to you, Kaveri.
Thank you so much, Indu. I hope you are able to see my screen.
Yes.
Okay. So, hello and welcome and good afternoon to all. I am Kaveri, a senior associate with CSTEP and one of the authors of the study we are about to discuss. And I'm very happy to introduce Kritika, who will also be presenting with me today. She's a senior analyst and economist in our team and a co-author of the study. So we represent the climate, environment, and sustainability vertical at CSTEP. We do work in modeling long-term strategies, climate action, both mitigation and adaptation perspectives, and air pollution. CSTEP also has more verticals doing some cutting edge and interesting work. Do check our website to know more about them. Today, we are very thrilled to talk about this report, which is in essence our attempt at answering some of the complex or wicked questions that came up in the process of expanding our Safari model. Interestingly, these were also issues or topics that we found that not a lot of modeling studies or long-term strategies seem to have covered. We felt the need for a more open dialogue and conversations around this in order to chart robust long-term developmental pathways. We have a fantastic panel of speakers after this presentation to kickstart this dialogue today. We have anchored the study around India's net zero commitments made at COP26 last year. So essentially, this is the context of this presentation that we are making today. And at this point, we have more questions than answers, but we think they are instrumental when developing long-term strategies. To give a quick quote that Ramya paraphrased from George Box's quote from the report, all models are wrong, but some ask the right questions. We have 5 key messages from the report. So I'll give a quick run through before we get into a bit of detail on each of them in the coming slides. Demand estimation is complicated given the uncertainty in relationship between GDP and other macroeconomic parameters and activity demand that 2 decades into the future. Next, we will look into some of the behavioral aspects that resonates with our mission life that was also recently emphasized in our COP27 in context of net zero. Then we will look at some of the challenges in industrial decarbonization and how complete decarbonization in industry may be contingent on carbon capture systems. Next, we will talk about some of the unresolved issues in power sector, which Ms. Sharma also mentioned in her keynote, and take a fresh look at nuclear energy with this perspective. And finally, we will look at some of the spillover effects of carbon pricing and how they may be resolved. Now over to Kritika for the next slide.
Kaveri. So we'll start with demand estimation. Most of the models that we currently use to analyze energy and emissions trajectories in India, like GCAM, Markle, and even Safari, use exogenous GDP as a driver for future sectoral demand. But so while the trajectory of GDP itself over time is widely discussed, its relationship with sectoral demand is often based on historical relationships. And the problem with this is that that relationship could change in the future, and the emissions trajectories could also end up being very different. So, for example, the relationship between passenger kilometers or PKM per capita and income per capita has historically been positively correlated. But if you think about it, people will not indefinitely be willing to increase their commute times as their income rises. And evidence from developed countries show us that there is a point at which PKM per capita saturates. And the level of income at which this saturation happens relies on very country and region specific factors like demographics and design intensity of cities and so on. So an example of some of the saturation levels for PKM per capita that have been observed are 10,000 kilometers in Japan to 27,000 kilometers in the US. So there is a pretty wide range. This kind of saturation also is seen in industries. So per capita consumption of materials like cement, steel, and aluminium saturate as countries develop. And as you can see, again, there is a large range. So cement per capita ranges from 350 kgs to 720 kgs. And based on the saturation levels that we assume, the emissions trajectories will be very different. So the graphs that we have here show us results from the Safari model, where we've modeled emissions trajectories based on the range of saturation levels that have been seen in developed countries. And we've seen that the trajectories are highly dependent on demand, sometimes even more than the decarbonization interventions that have been assumed. So how exactly would we determine India's saturation level? Because every country that can currently be termed developed has followed a very carbon intensive development pathway, and that's not a luxury that India has now. So to that extent, a clear idea of what India's pathway could look like is difficult to get from the existing literature. But we think that a bottom-up demand estimation framework would allow us to determine potential saturation levels. But so far, none of the models are able to do that for the entire Indian economy post 2050. So there are some models that use a partial bottom-up demand estimation framework, like EASA's Decent Living Standards framework, or Prayas's Rumi model, and our Safari model. But again, it hasn't been done for all of the sectors. So some of the sectors still require exogenous macroeconomic inputs to project future demand. So the saturation level assumption is clearly very important for net zero modeling. And we think that consulting with policymakers and discussing these assumptions and enabling bottom-up demand estimation for all sectors is an important step that the modeling community needs to take. We will move on to mission life now, which includes India's commitment to promoting sustainable lifestyles. So this generally means avoiding overconsumption that mimics lifestyles in the West. But India's per capita consumption is already far below the global average, and close to 30% of the population is in poverty. So it's not really fair to expect any major reductions in consumption until we meet at least basic development goals. But we can introduce behavioral shifts that can enable consumption within planetary boundaries, and they can help us reach net zero while avoiding some costly transitions. Modeling these shifts would require models that have a detailed representation of the demand side, and Safari has that. So I'm going to briefly go over some of the behavioral levers that we have in the agriculture, transport, and building sectors. In the agricultural sector, we saw that shifting diets and cultivation towards less water-intensive crops like millets has positive impacts on both environment and health. And some of the environmental benefits include lower emissions and less exploitation of groundwater. But this all depends on there being a push for high-yielding varieties of millets so that we don't compromise on food security, because millets generally have lower yield. In the transport sector, some of the behavioral levers are higher shares of non-motorized transport and public transport, a higher uptake of electric vehicles, and a higher share of rail in intercity travel. A recent CSTEP study also showed that people are willing to shift to public transport, even if it's up to 20% more expensive, as long as things like travel time and convenience in terms of last mile connectivity and so on are improved. In buildings, we look at electric cooking and the use of energy efficient appliances. So now Kaveri will take you through industry and power sector decarbonization.
Yeah, so the industry sector currently contributes to around 32% of the country's total emissions, and the sector is set to grow substantially to meet growing economic and developmental needs of an increasing population that is also urbanizing at unprecedented rates. Added to this, there is also the fact that most of the emissions intensive industries like steel and cement are what is called hard to abate. So all in all, going forward, its share in this emission pie is only going to increase. So industry plays a very critical role in India's net zero pathway. In the context of our larger net zero puzzle, we began by asking the question, how low can we go in industry emissions, and where are we hitting the limits? And therefore, what is the order of carbon capture systems or negative emission technologies that may be required for net zero to be possible? So let's take a quick look at two key hard to abate sectors. Cement is among the hardest to abate sectors, contributing to around 20% of industrial emissions in India. Let's take a quick look at decarbonization options for cement in the context of net zero. In terms of efficiency, Indian cement industry has assimilated state-of-the-art technology, and the plants are comparable to the world's best in terms of technology and efficiency. Considering that the efficiency levels are already high, the final bit of reduction will be a little more difficult and more expensive to unlock. What would be a more efficient strategy would be waste heat recovery, because cement manufacturing already requires very high temperature to process. The combined abatement potential of both of these levers we find in the Indian cement industry is up to 12% reduction in emissions. Alternative fuels is something that is successfully absorbed in the Indian cement industry, and there is also good policy support for continued and more aggressive adoption of alternative fuels. The mitigation potential of aggressively adopting alternative fuels is just under 7%, is what our analysis shows. Electrification of industries in general has been gaining some traction in the mitigation discourse, and electricity-based cement kilns are also in advanced stages of R&D. But we find that even for a small portion of cement production to be via electric kilns or even via indirect electrification through electrolytic hydrogen, it leads to massive increase in electricity consumption. So realistically, we expect around 28% of emissions can be mitigated by this lever, provided electricity requirements are met by the grid and not captively generated using coal like today. Next, we come to clinker substitution, which is the only lever that affects process emissions, which is what in fact essentially makes cement hard to abate. At best, commercially established and viable substitutes like fly ash and slag can only replace half of clinker. The maximum mitigation that is possible with this lever is to reduce around 20% of emissions. So the crux of the matter is that even after considering early and aggressive adoption of all these possibilities, they will all hit their limits, and the cement industry could be emitting as high as 300 million ton carbon dioxide equivalent in 2070, which implies a definite requirement of carbon capture systems for net zero. Coming to steel sector, steel can be produced via several production processes, most dominant in India being BF-BOF, which stands for Blast Furnace Basic Oxygen Furnace, and followed by EAF, which is for Electric Arc Furnace. Now, large integrated steel plants typically choose the BOF route, and small medium industry go the EAF route. Going forward, India's choice of production processes will be the principal determinant for steel industry emissions. Now, historically, developed economies have shown that BOF is likely to remain the dominant route until the demand for steel saturates, and then there will be a shift to EAF-based production. So in the near to medium term in India, the share of BOF-based steel is set to increase, which is also validated by our national steel policy. But at the same time, we have to consider that BOF plants are long-living assets that are hard to abate. We did an analysis and find that even BOF specific advanced measures like adding hydrogen as an auxiliary reducing agent and maximum efficiency possible can altogether only mitigate up to a maximum of 50% emissions in BOF plants. So if we further analyze that the National Steel Policy Plan of expanding BOF to meet 65% of steel production by 2035, and then phasing it out to meet our net zero commitments will result in significant stranded assets, or it can only be avoided by installing very expensive and very energy intensive CCUS. So considering all this and the fact that we already have 35 to 40% of production currently via EAF, could India then directly leapfrog to EAF stage without significantly expanding BOF? Now, EAF is suitable for making green steel, both from ore as well as scrap, and can be potentially fully decarbonized via electrolytic hydrogen. Like I mentioned before in the cement slide, this route too will be extremely energy intensive. To put this in perspective, if all of the steel production was via hydrogen-based EAF with electricity coming from the grid, it would require an additional whopping 580 gigawatt of operational capacity in the power sector in 2070. The steel policy also plans for cluster-based approach for EAF units for optimal land use and raw material use. We feel that such an approach could also help with finding more economical and off-grid renewable solutions for EAF, and as well as bring better scale and costs for hydrogen electrolyzers that will be useful for making green steel. Do read our report for further details on industrial decarbonization. Now, coming to the power sector, which is the most discussed sector in this space, being the most important sector from the emissions point of view, it is also the strong point of most of our integrated models. And by and large, these models are driven by a least cost logic and all have similar assumptions on macroeconomics and cost trends. So it's not surprising that more often than not, there is a lot of convergence in their results. The mainstream narrative in this space, at least in India, has been driven by exponentially falling RE costs, as well as conventional merit order dispatch, which is based on lowest marginal costs or fuel costs. This could be a case of seeing only part of the system, especially given such a long time frame. The land availability and acquisition issues around RE are pretty well known and is completely missing in the modeling narrative. Similarly, the possible change in cost dynamics due to import dependence for critical materials for RE technology, including solar, wind, and battery, is also completely missing from the scene. There are issues of intermittency, which Ms. Sharma also mentioned in her keynote address, which will persist despite grid-scale storage system due to seasonality and other such considerations. So what it points to is the dire need for low carbon, flexible or dispatchable sources of power supply to manage the intermittency for sustainable decarbonization. On the other hand, conventional merit order of dispatch, which is based on lowest marginal costs, will result in continued reliance on fossil-based sources for baseload as well as flexible operation. So despite all of these challenges in renewable energy, we do not think of them as unsurmountable. But what we believe is that acknowledging them and capturing them in our models in some form is important for drafting a more realistic and robust strategy, which will also help diversify our options and uncover options like nuclear energy. So India, to give a brief background on nuclear energy, India has a solid nuclear energy program that dates all the way back to 1948. But installed nuclear capacity is only 7.5 gigawatt. Now, this low number can be attributed to various reasons, but most significantly, it can be attributed to our complex geopolitical situation and the sanctions that were on us until last decade. Arguably, nuclear energy could have played a better role if not for the worldwide public and political backlash following the Fukushima incident. There are plans and proposals in India as of today at various stages to install around 65 gigawatt of nuclear capacity. In parallel, our Department of Atomic Energy has also been unwaveringly pursuing the three-stage atomic energy plan as chalked out by Dr. Bhabha back in 1954 to transition to thorium in the very long term, of which we have huge reserves. Back then, the rationale driving this plan was that of energy security, but it is a plan that is still relevant today from the sustainability point of view. We have done a deep dive into this at CSTEP, and even our most conservative estimates show that at least 200 gigawatt of nuclear energy can be operational by 2100, starting in the 2050s at virtually zero fuel costs. We ran a scenario in Safari and found considerable emissions and land savings are possible if this route was realized. Briefly going back to our earlier point of the need for low carbon, flexible or dispatchable sources for decarbonization, nuclear being an ultra low carbon source, could it play this role? Now, conventional merit order dictates that units with lower operational or fuel costs be operated in full power, or in other words, as a base load to make the most of it. And units with higher fuel costs, like natural gas, for instance, be partially loaded so that they can increase or decrease output to operate flexibly to manage intermittency or peak demand or some such. Now, nuclear fuel, as we know, is extremely energy dense and therefore very cheap, whereas nuclear plants are extremely capital intensive, which makes it a traditional base load. Due to this logic, there is not a lot of global experience of operating nuclear flexibly, even though it's technically possible, and has been done by countries like France and Germany, where nuclear contributes sizably to their power supply. So the short answer for this question, whether nuclear can be operated flexibly in India as of now, is no, because obviously we have not reached that kind of scale in nuclear power. However, it does make sense in the kind of long-term scenario that we were discussing, and there are some interesting design options for the same. The details of these are available in the report if you can just go through it. Now, since electrification is a major decarbonization strategy for a lot of major emitting sectors like transport and industry, power sector can either make or break our net zero goal and long-term strategy. So our ultimate objective with Safari model is to enrich the modeling environment to enable scenario planning, to consider real-world decision-making, and take into account multiple futures to identify robust and adaptive actions. Now, back to Kritika to talk about carbon pricing chapter from the report.
Thanks. So carbon pricing is often discussed as a very easily implementable low-cost solution to the low carbon transformation issue. And we wanted to understand all of the potential intended and unintended consequences and making special note of any issues that could be unique or particularly severe in India. So we've created a causal loop diagram which helps us understand the trade-offs of carbon pricing. We'll start with loop B1, which shows us the most obvious effect of carbon pricing, which is making emissions intensive commodities more expensive. So it raises the price, the cost of fossil fuel production, which raises the price of electricity generated through fossil fuels, which is an essential commodity. But at the same time, the B3 loop shows us that because fossil fuel based commodities are becoming more expensive, it now makes economic sense to switch to low carbon alternatives since they're relatively less expensive, both from a producer's perspective and from a consumer's perspective. So essentially, the carbon price is creating this market for low carbon alternatives, which should ultimately lead us to lower emissions. But what we want to keep in mind is that making these alternatives available to people requires a lot of investment, which needs to be spearheaded by the government and supported by the private sector. But if we look at the government revenue side of things specifically in loop R, this investment is basically creating another source of competition for limited public funds, which is a bit of a problem in India because we're already struggling to allocate funds effectively to achieve all of our basic development goals. And on top of that, carbon pricing can worsen inequalities within the country because in the absence of cheap alternatives that are easily accessible, people will face higher prices for essentials. And since poorer people spend a larger part of their income on these essentials, it significantly raises their cost of living without actually enabling much of a reduction in emissions. So ensuring that carbon pricing revenue is redistributed to the worst affected population is a design choice that can be made to deal with this inequality. But again, it reduces the amount of additional revenue that's available to incentivize innovation in low carbon technology and such. So essentially, basically, there are a lot of trade-offs in implementing a carbon price in a country like India, especially when we realize that it's not a substitute for other kinds of non-market policies that can help us accelerate the transition to net zero. So CSTEP did recently do a study using a social accounting matrix-based multiplier model. And one of the scenarios we looked at was increasing indirect carbon taxes or fossil fuel taxes, where we played around with where the tax was imposed. And we found that taxing refined fossil fuels, which is what households ultimately consume, would significantly raise the household's annual expenditure. But imposing the tax on unrefined fossil fuels raise the cost of production for industries, mainly emissions intensive industries, which could potentially incentivize them to shift to low carbon strategies. But the higher cost wasn't passed through to households. So that sort of reduces the negative impacts that carbon prices could have on equality. We also looked at some supplementary policies like investment in renewable energy and subsidies for solar power generation. And we saw that they had positive impacts on the overall economy, like higher GDP and higher household income. And we think that these could support carbon prices and make them more effective by encouraging the development and deployment of alternatives. So, for example, the success of carbon pricing in Germany is partly attributed to the availability of solar and wind power plants that had been developed as a consequence of a previously implemented subsidy scheme. So what the carbon price did was make these plants more viable. In the absence of actual low carbon alternatives, a carbon price could possibly just encourage a switch from coal to gas, like it did in Europe under the European Union emissions trading scheme. But in India, if that happened, it would cause energy security concerns because we already have very high energy import bills. And aside from that, it's not transformative enough to take us to net zero anyway. It could lock us into investing in emissions intensive technologies. In the context of designing and implementing carbon prices in India, we talk about in the report, we talk about how India has some experience with indirect carbon pricing, like the Perform Achieve Trade scheme or the PAT scheme and the coal cess. And these kind of give us a starting point to work on implementing a direct carbon price. But we feel that maybe future research can focus on hybrid carbon pricing instruments and such, so that we can work on ensuring long-term price stability and revenue generation. So basically, there are a lot of spillover effects to consider when implementing a carbon price, especially in India, but it can play a role in transforming energy systems as long as it's supplemented by other non-market policies like investment in cleaner alternatives and making them accessible. It is an option as an additional revenue stream as long as we take care of the unintended equity issues, because we do need an additional revenue stream. We can't rely solely on international climate finance given how uncertain it is. So these are some of the key takeaways for us from the report. We'll finally look at briefly at the methodologies that we used. We used two models. The first one is the Safari model, which is a system dynamics tool that's driven by quality of life benchmarks like housing, nutrition, education, and so on. It explicitly captures the interlinkages between sectors. You can read more about it by scanning the QR code. The second model that we used is a social accounting matrix or SAM-based multiplier model. And the SAM that we used has a detailed electricity generation sector that differentiates between solar, hydro, coal, and so on as energy sources. And that allowed us to model things like fossil fuel taxes and solar subsidies. So you can read the policy brief we recently published by scanning the QR code. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. We thank Bloomberg Philanthropies for supporting this phase of the work. You can post your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaveri and Kritika. Thank you for that. Next, I think without wasting time, let's move into the panel discussion, which is on the consideration for India's net zero strategy development. I request Ramya Natarajan, who is the group head for climate change mitigation, to take over from here, introduce the panel and moderate the session. Over to you, Ramya.
Yeah, thanks, Indu, and hi, everyone. We have a wonderful panel of experts today to discuss further the role of modeling and also some of the questions that Kaveri and Kritika raised in the presentation. So let me just introduce the panel first. We have Dr. Ritu Mathur, who is currently a senior energy economist leading the recently set up modeling and integrated assessments unit at Niti Aayog, with 3 decades of experience in research consultancy and teaching in the areas of sustainable development, climate mitigation, energy economy, and environment modeling at TERI and TERI School of Advanced Studies. Dr. Mathur has also been associated with IPCC as lead author and reviewer and has several publications in the low carbon development space. Welcome, Ritu, and thanks for joining us today. You've dealt extensively with modeling and policy circles, so we're excited to hear your insights. Ms. Ulka Kelkar is Director Climate Program WRI, India. She's an economist with 2 decades of experience in climate change research, capacity building, and outreach. She leads WRI India's work on climate policy, which aims to support India's pathway to a climate resilient, low carbon economy through judicious national policies, carbon market mechanisms, and also effective implementation in states and cities. Ulka has also reviewed our work at various stages, and we're a big fan. Welcome, Ulka. Then we have Professor Shaun Ray. She's an economist specializing in industry and international trade issues. Her areas of interest include global value chains, technological upgrading of Indian industries, free trade agreements, and trade creation effects, technology transfer, FDI efficiency and production of firms, financial inclusion, energy and climate related issues. She's also an author. Some of her books include Global Value Chains and the Missing Links and Low Carbon Pathways to Growth in India. Thanks for joining us, Shaun. We look forward to your insights as an economist. Then we have Dr. Kaveri Aichetira. She's assistant professor at IIT Delhi. Kaveri's research is focused on the transition of energy and related sectors in the context of climate change under deep uncertainty. She approaches problems from the lenses of complex socio-technical systems, institutional analysis, systems thinking, and economics. Thanks for being here, Kaveri. Your area of expertise is very relevant to this discussion, so we're excited to get started. We'll have 3 rounds today. Round 1 on models and their usefulness. round 2 on questions from our report. And round 3, we'll have a Q&A from the audience and any closing remarks that you may have. So I'll start with you, Kaveri. Back in 2020, you'd written this piece on what should policymakers ask modelers. And you're also now part of the Climate Futures project, doing a lot of model comparisons to get insights on such things. So my question is, how can we ensure that models are useful for policymaking? How do we judge a model as being relevant or valid when, especially such long-term models, if we don't do time travel to actually make sure that these results are correct? And also, to make models policy relevant, does it also entail making them politically correct? For example, do we need the models to show like a high GDP growth or full implementation of a certain famous policy? So would that make it more appealing for use and relevance in policy?
Thank you, Ramya. There are two Kaveris here, and that's never happened to me before. So I'm very excited, actually. I have a namesake, but these are important and tough questions with no easy answers, just principles, I guess, for guiding our thinking as analysts. To your first question, are models useful to policymakers? I think I'd reframe that slightly to ask, are models today addressing the questions and decisions that policymakers need answers for? And the short answer is yes, to some extent, but I don't think we're doing it sufficiently. So let me explain with some concrete examples. Although the policymaker we had on our on this event today she gave us some examples too. I think a lot of the questions and I'll focus more on the domestic context. So, for instance, should we invest in R&D into hydrogen at this point or later, or at all? And at what cost, right? If we introduce a carbon pricing mechanism, how do we ensure the development of small and medium industries as well, which your team also mentioned, Kritika mentioned. It might affect equity in ways that we don't understand clearly at this point. What are the distributional impacts of decarbonization in general? How can they be managed? And how do we get robust decisions under uncertainty from demand growth, uncertainty from costs, uncertainty from even impact. However, modeling studies are not always equipped to address these uncertainties. Modeling studies are equipped to some modeling studies are equipped, many in fact, are equipped to answer sort of least cost related questions. How can we get the best decision under a certain, or best meaning a least cost decision under the knowledge we have regarding costs? So I feel like for example, what is the ideal mix of decarbonization technologies? What do they look like, or strategies? And which is the question your report also started with, right? Like what level of industrial decarbonization can we reach, which is a what question and much less a how question under uncertainty, right? So I think this is the work that we have to do, which is translating what models can do with what the policymakers need. That is to convert uncertainty into risks and opportunities, and then into choices for a set of outcomes that all the stakeholders involved care about. And this requires careful thought and discussion, reflection on what outcomes do we care about? Is it just GDP? Is it also equity? Is it just technology mix? Is it the emissions? Is it what are those outcomes? And I feel like there needs to be stronger discussion at the outset before we start building our models on what it is, what are we trying to get, what kinds of outcomes matter, what kinds of decisions need to be made, what do we really not know about these decisions, right? About the context in which the decisions are being made. So, and this is what I just said about the outcomes are sort of the objectives that we might want to reach, right? But also, we should separate that from what we have control over and we don't have control over. So the key exogenous uncertainties, which are extremely uncertain and highly impactful, those we need to really be clear about what those uncertainties are, why we think they're highly impactful to the outcomes that we're interested in. And these could be fuel trends, or costs are the major uncertainties, or technology feasibility. These are the most uncertainties that are most often talked about. But what is important about it is that we should acknowledge that these are uncertainties that we don't have control over. So, and for those uncertainties, it is important to separate them from the factors which we do have control of. So what I'm trying to get at is the GDP question that you alluded to earlier. We might want to see outcomes for a certain context, but if we have no control over that context, as good analysts, we should separate out that context and possible potential outcomes and actions that we do have control over. So it's important, to have that separation, especially when we talk about these big assumptions like GDP, which can have very important consequences on our outcomes. So I think I'll stop at that. And just with a call to shift towards robustness of decisions rather than the best or least cost decisions.
Thanks, Kaveri. So would you say that maybe using a bunch of diverse models that were meant to do different things to answer one question is one way of going about such a
Yeah, absolutely. So the diversity of models addresses uncertainties within the system, right? What we don't, for example, how does technology development impact GDP? Or how does GDP, or how does demand impact? What are the relationships within the economic system? There is uncertainty about that. I don't think there are theories, macroeconomic theories about how these relationships work out, but there's no clear answer. So I think multiple models help us address the system uncertainty, which is important too.
Right. So I'll bring in Ritu here. You've been coordinating the India Climate and Energy Modeling Forum discussions at NITI Aayog and been involved heavily with the modeling community in India. So about this, group of diverse models, globally, there's a growing consensus that there are just a handful of models developed by the global north that are used in these IPCC reports and analysis. Do you think that is the same case for India? Is there a good diversity of models, or is the discourse still largely driven by the 2-3 well-established cost optimization models, which were originally developed for maybe Western countries, or they're global models with India being just one part of it, with no considerations for equity or specific developmental needs of a country like India? So, and are the newer models viewed with too much skepticism?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question. I think I'll break it into two parts as I go along. And I think what we are talking about here in the context of this particular paper is largely the models which have been used for the national context and looking at the national framings. And typically, when you look at these long-term India-centric national models, what we call models in layman terms are actually frameworks, which are generalized codes of whatever form they may be, a set of equations for either cost optimization of a system and so on. So really, these are generalized frameworks which come as a blank box. They are not set with certain fuels or technologies or coefficients per se. And the modeling team or the modeler really fits in a design and a set of numbers to populate the data and make it into a model. So if I were to say, I'm using the India model or a Times model for India, it's me who has populated the data for India. So being skeptical about the framework itself is not the question. The frameworks are generally fairly robust, well thought out, framings which are done over decades. And most of these models, such as a Markell or a Times or a GCAM or whatever, they are very robust frameworks and used by several countries. But having said that, what goes into the model and how you develop these models for your own context matters a hell of a lot in terms of what is the kind of data and assumptions that you put in, what are the kind of boundaries that you work with, and how do you sort of develop these. And all of these models, which I think have been talked about in the paper also, are fairly different models. They all don't work with the same kind of framing. GCAM is very different from the EPS, is very different from the Times, is very different from the one that Irade uses or CW uses, and so on. So given that all of these have very different structures and framings, using multiple models with similar kind of storylines or assumptions and then trying to compare what they spew out is fairly meaningful and important to look at, the kind of diversity or the kind of similarity in outputs that they might give. And from that point of view, I think India has got a good capacity of modelers. What we need is for modeling activities to sort of come together, support each other with the complementarities that different teams might have with the positives that each framework might have. So, different models can better address, or different teams of modelers can better address some things than the others. So when I talk about the boundary conditions also, I think Kaveri mentioned, the aspect of does land issue get taken up when you're looking at power, or, are we looking at what happens to people or so on. There are so many elements which you need to integrate in a good study, which can give you all the kinds of insights that you really need. So from that perspective, somebody may be able to better represent the social aspects. Somebody may be better able to represent economic aspects, trade aspects, supply chain aspects, electricity downscaling and regionalization aspects. So looking at multiple frameworks and getting the best out of each of the frameworks, I think is what I would say is important. The second part which I wanted to come to was the global context that we heard Ms. Richa Sharma also talk about earlier in the day. And I would say to some extent, the modeling in recent years within the global context has been somewhat more limited, especially when it looks at bringing in the equity aspects. There have been one-off carbon budget kind of studies which have been brought out. I know Terry did a couple, maybe a decade ago or so. Again, groups of modelers from India have been part of global consortia. But I think what we miss is setting the principles within the global south, or say even in the Indian context, in terms of looking at how to share these carbon budgets across countries. And obviously, if the studies get led by the developed world, the sharing principles might be selectively chosen or may not work to the best interests of what are better for India and so on. So again, we've had some discussions and events on how to share the global budget and whether the equity aspects are being adequately included in the studies. I think a lot more needs to be done there, and that is something which we need to focus on. But again, the conversation, while needing to talk and bring in more transparency, discussion of assumptions, stakeholder consultations, all of that is good. But I think what we also need are better deep dives, better sectoral assessments, better data, better coordinated studies, more consistent investment in developing our community of modelers and engaging them together to feed into each other's research and bring out the complementarities. So I think that's something, again, at NITI Aayog, through the ICMF platform, we are trying to enhance that engagement among modelers and see that these cross-cutting synergies and issues and feedbacks can sort of talk to each other and help provide more meaningful conversations and inputs to decision making. And of course, again, the last point that I wanted to make was what Kaveri also did allude to. I think over time, modeling needs, the needs of the decision makers, they also keep changing. I think I remember about a decade ago, everything, the focus was on energy pricing. How should we price gas versus coal and so on? Today, the debate has obviously shifted more towards what do we need, and if we want to sort of, try to bring about decarbonization or try to look at net zero. And the immediate needs now are again changing and transitioning from the what to the how. We know that we want to go towards green hydrogen, or we know we want to go towards electricity. We know we want to have more of nuclear or hydro and so on, but how, when, and how much to plan for. So I think the needs change, and therefore models all the time need to evolve. We need to bring in multiple and varied dimensions to address the needs. So a model never is complete. A model is never perfect and never gets made. But I think the issue questions keep changing over time. And at this point in time, we have a multiplicity of questions and issues which are needing to be raised because of the kind of transformative changes that we need to bring in. And obviously the social, economic, environmental, all the dimensions needing to come together, especially in case of India, when we have to choose our unique pathway, which is different from that of the developed world, is making or is necessarily going to make this decision-making fairly complex. So we do have a challenge ahead, and we do therefore need multiple models, multiple frameworks to be able to address all the kinds of questions that we need. I hope that sort of answers what you were looking for.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a great point on the constantly evolving needs and also what models help us do over time and what they are going to be used for. And you mentioned that the cost optimization framework itself is not the problem. It's more of the data that you put in or what assumptions you make about it. So I'll just turn to Ulka and pose the same question. Do you agree with Ritu's answer? What's been your experience? Because you've been involved in developing some of these newer models, which are not based necessarily on cost optimization, and they use more systems thinking. So.
Right, thanks, Ramya. And of course, CSTEP has been a pioneer in applying developing systems dynamics model, a big fan of Safari. And I must say that the questions you posed for us today are just very thoughtfully framed. So thank you very much. I don't think our answers will be as interesting as the questions. And to the two Kaveris, I must say I live in Bangalore, where every other person is a Kaveri, so I feel right at home. But let me just sort of answer your question, Ramya, by saying that skepticism is good, both of the new models and the old established models. But what I fear a little bit, what is my concern, is that the more established modeling approaches will not throw up opportunities for leapfrogging of the kind that Kaveri mentioned briefly. And I'll just give one example, right? If we want to, for example, model for assess what might be the trade-offs with employment. Will there be new jobs created or will there be old jobs created? Most of these models don't even include employment. And if they do, then often the assumption is full employment. so that if there is an increase in one sector in jobs, then it must come at the cost of another sector where jobs must go down, because the assumption is that the economy is at full employment. So that's not a very realistic assumption, first of all, for a country like ours. But basically what it means for policy, if you look at the results of such models, is that there can be no new job creation. There can only be job shifts. And similarly, correspondingly, what it means for skilling or reskilling or upskilling. So this is a sort of concern that I have, which skepticism about new models might lead to fewer opportunities about leapfrogging and so on for countries like us. The second point really that I want to make is that models can and should illustrate trade-offs, but that requires three things. One is that the assumptions are transparent. Right? I mean, that is the first thing that we should be able to interrogate. We should be able to replace with newer data as it becomes available. The EPS, for example, which we've been working on with energy innovation, is completely open source. It has a public web interface, it has public documentation, and its entire input database is available for public download. So transparency of assumptions is the first requirement. The second is that they can illustrate trade-offs, again, only if they are built to explore these trade-offs, like the behavioral aspects, the equity aspects, the resource use aspects. And Safari does a very good job, for example, of bringing in housing and land use and cement, material use and all of that. At WRI also, we've been working with a group called Knowledge SRL to build a new model called the Green Economy Model to highlight these equity aspects and land use trade-offs. And where the model is limited, we want to do analysis outside of the model, taking sample survey data and look at what might be the implications of climate policy by income decile. And one of the preliminary results we found is that climate action may be good for everybody, but it seems to be better for the rich than for the poor. So the same kinds of inequities that we have in society may get perpetuated unless you have complementary policies for just transition in the largest, broadest possible sense of the word. So these kinds of aspects are just beginning to be included in global models and in Indian models. And then my third and last point is, as my colleague Deepthi said in a workshop the other day, that models help to understand the system, like the causal loop diagram that you just showed, right? How is everything linked to each other? Let's try to understand it. And again, when I sent your questions around to my colleagues, Varun Agarwal, my colleague, wrote back, and I'm going to just quote him because these words are just very precise, is that policy decisions involve normative choices. Models cannot substitute for public debate and participatory processes. So a model can show, for example, that a particular climate action may lead to better health quality as a result of other pollutants going down, or it may lead to job losses in the coal mining sector. But if you actually were to look at it, put yourself in the shoes of an asthma patient, or look at it from the perspective of a coal miner about to lose their job, then the model cannot really make that trade-off. That is a matter that has to come down to public debate, participation at the local level, I mean, as much as possible through empowering our local governance institutions. So I'll just end over there by saying that, yes, we can build new models, provided there is transparency of assumptions, provided we try to bring in some of these other aspects, whether in the model or outside the model, and provided we try not to oversell the predictive nature of these, even though that is the demand for policymakers, but just use it to illustrate trade-offs and to inform public debate. Thanks.
Thanks, Olga. Yeah, nice, good points. And I agree with, models are like the starting point for where we get the discussion started, and then we keep kind of refining assumptions around various parameters. I'll go to Shaun next and kind of talk about a little bit of the economics side of models. And we did talk about GDP, and it was also presented earlier today. So we make cost trajectory assumptions, GDP assumptions for decades into the future, and how and for the lack of a better way to do it, we also base it on historical trends. So whether it's a regression or it's future growth rates for different, for GDP or other parameters, it is based on an assumption that historical trends will continue or slow down, or it's based on how it's been related in history. So what are your thoughts on that? If at all, if there is a better way to estimate these kinds of future growth trajectories? And also on the concept of decoupling growth and emissions, is green growth really a possibility given India's developmental requirements?
Right. Thanks, Ramya. Firstly, I would like to congratulate CSTEP on the excellent report. I mean, I really enjoyed reading it. So to answer your question, and some of the points have been already raised by both Ritu and Ulfa. Now, the purpose, actually, we have to look at why are we modeling and what is going into the model. So it's said that a model is as good as its assumptions. And, the thing is that ultimately a model is, of course, it's an approximation of reality, because you cannot actually, if you have captured everything of reality into your model, the model will be untractable. So you have to make simplifying assumptions. But then in the process of making those assumptions, are you taking away more than what you're getting from the model? So this trade-off is this is actually the judgment and of the modeler, and it comes with years of practice. Ritu can testify for that how much of effort it takes to balance that. So if we just look back on the GDP question that you raised, the growth question. This is the question that economists have been grappling for a very long time, that why do countries grow, and why do some countries grow faster than others? And that is actually the genesis of all the growth models that you have in economics. The starting point is, of course, the solo model. I'll just talk about one assumption, and I'll just illustrate that, how that has, changing that assumption has led to newer kind of predictions. So, for example, the three critical things that are there in any growth model is that, what role externalities play, what is the role of increasing returns, and basically whether there are decreasing returns in production. Now, of knowledge. This is the sort of the workhouse of a standard neoclassical growth model, and it has gone on to, you've added other assumptions to get what are called the endogenous growth models. Now, one of the things, so basically in the neoclassical growth model, what happens is that per capita income growth is achieved through an exogenous rate of technological progress, which means that whatever is happening is actually happening outside the model. The neoclassical growth model cannot account for since it's exogenous. But basically, by getting rid of one of the assumptions, the assumption of diminishing return to capital accumulation, one can get a very different result, which is actually that it is no longer, the technological progress is no longer exogenous, and you don't need that anymore, basically. And you have what is called the AK models. Coming to the climate models specifically, I think, again, the genesis of that work is starting with Nordhaus's 1991 very famous paper. It's called "To Slow or Not to Slow," and it actually posits that question right there: that can we grow without? Can we grow sustainably in some sense? And so Nordhaus in his paper, that is it started with a very simple equation for motion of global mean temperature, but then it had other things. It had a social welfare function with a discount rate, and then other things. Recently, actually, there's been some work by some authors who have shown that, you know, this the trade-off between sustainable growth and environmental policy can be shown very nicely by bringing in things like public investment in pollution. And also, so basically, some of the impact of adverse growth or unsustainable growth can be countered by those kinds of assumptions or those kinds of approaches. And in fact, in real life, we are also seeing that, aren't we? Because we are seeing that many countries are doing some of the things that you also talked about, the decarbonization and the taxes or the subsidies for clean energy, etc. So I think in some sense, again, there is some convergence between what we are trying to do with these models and but bringing in my more realistic assumptions. And in practice, also some of these policies are also being tried out. So in my view, it's actually in some sense converging and leading to better outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. So I'll just go back to Kaveri to pick a bit more on uncertainty. I know you answered the previous question with some of this, the two types of uncertainty, that is one that you control and one you don't control. And we talked about saturation levels and how do we estimate these for India in the presentation. And these are still kind of maybe controllable scenarios in the sense that we can have a range, and the range scenarios typically will just give you seeing those different curves at different ranges. But when it comes to shape scenarios, so maybe the entire system changes over time, and then that kind of uncertainty, which I would categorize as something maybe we can't control. How do we really do analysis under such deep uncertainty, where it's not just a range that you have to assume, it's also the entire system and everything that could change in the long term?
Yeah, you framed the question very specifically, Ramya. Thank you. I think maybe I'd add a little more specificity to the types of uncertainties. So there are, for instance, when you showed a range, it means that the uncertainty has been quantified. There is some sort of a probability distribution that you have employed to arrive at a range. What if you don't have a probability distribution? You might have maybe a ranking of likelihoods, but not a probability distribution. And even more uncertain could be that you don't have a ranking of likelihoods of a certain, context, but you just have plausible, unranked factors, right? Which are exogenous and have an influence on the outcome. So that's just even clarifying and talking about what level of uncertainty it is, how much confidence do we have in each factor, what maybe are the drivers of each of these factors, and how plausible they are or not. How many people you've spoken to identify this sense, this future, plausible futures, is one very important job that we have to do. It's not just, it's very easy as researchers to just rely on what has previously been written in academic literature and not do maybe a more ground driven data collection, or even just a large sort of expert elicitation for these plausible uncertainties and futures from a context perspective. And then there's also the system perspective as well, which is within the system, What do we account for? What do we not account for? How much do we know? How much do we not know? And just really being very, very reflective about each causal relationship that we speak about within the model, and clarifying what we don't know is extremely important to do. But at the end of that, having clarified all of that, having written down, having reflected on all of that, all you have is still an analysis which is done in a snapshot of time, which cannot possibly be the definitive, provide definitive insights for the next 70, 50 years or so. And so I think as modelers, one way or as analysts who think about plausible futures, one way of dealing with this uncertainty is to use a dynamic adaptive approach, where not only do you constantly be aware of vulnerabilities and opportunities from the external factors which you can't control, and design policies which account for these vulnerabilities and opportunities, and then also talk about seizing actions where you seize the opportunities, hedging actions where you hedge against risk, but also think about signposts and triggers. So from your modeling analysis, basically a platform where you account for various factors which impact possible futures, right? So in this list of factors, what are signposts or triggers that we should be aware of, based on which we can, like for instance, if we realize that battery costs are falling much sooner than we expect, what do we need to do? Or if we realize that, well, nothing has happened on hydrogen, what do we need to do? So, accounting for those uncertainties and being aware of, making ourselves and, our society aware of what these signposts and triggers can be, and possible actions to respond to those signposts and triggers would be, I think, a good way of dealing with, long-term uncertainty. Yeah, I think another point that I think we pay lesser attention to is lock-ins and path dependencies in our analysis. So we do a lot of analysis about which policy actions, but I think maybe your system dynamics models do a little more of that. At least they allow us in the EPS framework. I know that you can put in policy levers at different points in time, but just thinking more explicitly about when you employ a certain policy and what impacts that has on lock-ins and overall cost of the system. I think that is something which we can also focus on a little more, even in our snapshot analysis.
Thanks. So you're saying also that some of the uncertainty can be dealt with by these discussions that we have at every stage. So we keep dealing with, those sensitivities.
Yeah, and just even noting what signposts and triggers we should be looking out for. What are those, signs which we can use to reassess the objectives and the policy decisions that we've made.
Yeah. Thanks. So now I'll move away from uncertainty for some time, and maybe this question posed to Ritu for kind of taking what the other Kaveri presented earlier on the power sector and nuclear energy. So, in India, you've worked with Markle extensively, and, Kaveri pointed out that there are a few things like the land constraints or cost dynamics due to critical materials availability or other aspects that aren't captured in those models. And India also has a lot of competing objectives seemingly competing objectives: decarbonization, development, energy security. So what would it really take to move away from coal in that sense? And is nuclear power as an option for baseload and also flexible load something that we should talk about more?
So definitely, I mean, here when we start looking at RE, or for that matter, we're using this as an example, but any other alternative as well needs to be evaluated in terms of all the other factors which would affect it, like you mentioned about intermittency or land use issues or supply chain issues when it comes to being able to procure enough raw material for making it in India, or procuring even solar panels from outside. So all of these assessments necessarily need to again go into a fair bit of detail to be able to bring them into whatever frameworks we are using. And the point that I was making about complementarity and is about using different frameworks, of course, but also being able to patience into whatever framework you're using, whether you're using a cost-benefit integrated assessment framework, or you're using a system dynamics kind of a framework. The idea is to be able to bring in the element of the uncertainties regarding all of the other aspects as well. So I think that is becoming more and more crucial in looking at the transformative changes, and RE is no exception. So while we know that, on a one-to-one, if you're looking at the costs falling in case of RE, they are at par with that of coal-based thermal generation, but then there are limits because of the relatively higher cost of storage still, because of the intermittency aspects, or because of where the sun shines more or the wind blows more at different places in time, varying across the length and breadth of the country, or where there might be challenges because of land and so on. So that itself is, I think, needing to study this holistically is more important and relevant than just saying that the costs of RE are falling down, and therefore that becomes a single bullet that models must try to internalize. Coming on to the thing about coal versus RE, and how soon you step up, how much you ramp up, whether you can already start saying that you need not have any new coal. I think all of these things require a lot more balancing. They require a lot more thought before we can make any such assumptions of by when can we ramp up, how much, or how much can we start shutting down, and so on, especially on considerations of energy security. Because again, I mean, the definition itself of energy security is not limited to that of self-sufficiency in terms of fuel imports alone, but in terms of being able to sustain reliable, affordable energy needs for our growth and development. So, I mean, you have to be able to look at the costs that people would need to pay, and what it could have in terms of implications, in terms of equity aspects as well. You need to be able to look at how would you hedge disruptions with regard to raw material availabilities, and whether we might be ending up from a fuel disruption or fuel import dependency problem and switching over to a raw material dependency problem. So there are enough things which need to still be looked at before we can start talking about moving away from coal. I think we still need to look at how to balance this, and that is what our modeling needs to zero in on and focus more on in the short to medium term, while we look at the long-term decarbonization. I think the last thing that you mentioned was about nuclear as well. So again, I mean, by the same token, I think the need to look at spatially and temporally disaggregated deeper dives into the power system within the entire economy-wide system is equally important. How much of electricity are we likely to require under all kinds of circumstances of growth and development, of movements in industry and transport towards electrification, and what kind of alternatives of all other kinds are going to be available at different points in time within the space. So I think nuclear, hydro, coal, and renewables all of them seem to be important players at one stage or the other, as far as we can see it right now. And that's where much of the modeling in the power sector still needs to, look deeper before we can look at what choices come in at what levels and at what times. So there are no easy answers to this, and it's no single fuel or a single technology. Even within RE, it's all about, how much should you do centralized or decentralized? How do you pan out your system of incentives or regional sharing principles and so on, so that you're able to maintain the adequacy and the reliability of energy needs through the country as you develop.
Yeah, and I think there was an ICMF session where we discussed what energy security actually means for India. Like, is it just fuel import reduction, or like you mentioned, we start becoming dependent on other materials and such. So it's an interesting, what are our national priorities, and then say, go back to Kaveri's point on what do we want from the models should first be discussed with, and then we kind of make the model according to that. Right. So I'll just shift gears again to carbon pricing. These are my last two questions for this round. So to Ulka, Kritika presented the causal loop diagram, and there are three very important loops. There was one reinforcing and two balancing loops, which are they need to work to make carbon pricing effective. And the reinforcing loop was about using the revenue back to recycling it back to households to avoid inequality, but also for it to work, we need low carbon alternatives. And if we don't, then there's nothing to really switch to when you have higher priced fossil fuels. So how do we, get to this balance between, because we also need to substitute the revenue and get, if we're not having enough climate finance, how do we get enough low carbon alternatives to make sure that they're available to shift to cheap low carbon alternatives? And also the revenue recycling part, do you think it's something that will work in India? Will carbon pricing be the silver bullet for achieving some of our climate targets?
Thanks, Ramya. Very dangerous to get an economist to talk about carbon pricing. They'll go on and on forever. But no, it's obviously not a silver bullet at all. But what it seems to be is that often it seems to be the silver policy lever in a lot of conventional models, right? It's what makes the model stick, carbon pricing. And it's the constraint under which the optimization happens. That's operationalized by a carbon tax. Often that's why it comes up as very important in a lot of model findings. In the EPS, for instance, the minimum mandate for carbon-free electricity is just as important and underlying or fundamental policy lever for effecting change as the carbon tax, which, as you showed in your causal loop diagram, levels the playing field between fossil fuels and new renewable energy technologies. And not only does it decarbonize the power sector, but it also leads to decarbonizing the transport sector, the industry sector, the residential sector. So that's why it's a very important lever in our models. But is it easier or more cost effective? I was recently in a workshop where Cambridge Econometrics presented their E3ME model results for India. And E3ME, in fact, is one of those models that doesn't assume full employment. And they showed that for the transport sector, a subsidy can be more cost effective than a tax, which seems very strange. But one of our researchers actually explained that by saying that in the early stages, a subsidy is introduced in the transport sector to support electric vehicles, for example, which are a very small share of the market in the beginning. Whereas a tax would be applied on the existing internal combustion engine vehicles, which are the very large share of the market. And the people who pay for, whether it is the subsidy or whether, who have to face the tax, are people like us, who buy cars or who pay taxes and supports the subsidy. So the cost effectiveness of it sort of works out that a subsidy might be more cost effective in an early stage than a carbon tax that effected this kind of change. Another way of looking at the impact of a carbon tax or a carbon price is, does it make electricity more expensive? What happens to the levelized cost of electricity? And the EPS, in fact, if you see the weighted average levelized cost of electricity actually goes up in the short term, because in the short term, coal is still a large share of the electricity mix. So if you introduce a carbon tax early and there's still a lot of coal, it will get reflected as a higher cost of electricity. But if you think about it, the faster you scale up renewables, the faster actually you can make that electricity cheaper. So if you actually allow for sort of ratcheting up some of those policy levers which allow renewables to come up faster and coal to phase down, then the LCOE may not be that much higher. The issue of revenue recycling that you've raised is often, when you see literature from, say, Scandinavian countries, it always emphasizes that it's very important to have public trust in the government. But we do have a lot of mechanisms by which we could potentially recycle revenue. I mean, for example, we have the PM Kisan scheme, which gives 6,000 rupees to every farmer, every small farmer. You could just similarly use something like that, or you could increase the MNREGA wage rate, or make more number of days of work available. So there are many mechanisms by which revenue can be recycled. And a separate issue, of course, is, as you clearly highlighted, is if we have this transition to cleaner vehicles, electric vehicles, and they are run by cleaner electricity, then how do you replace the loss of revenue from the taxes on petrol and diesel, which Prayas's work has in fact pointed out that it is something like 35% of the central government's tax revenue in FY21. And the issue that has happened is that, for example, there was a change in, I think, 2019, where corporate taxes were reduced from 30% to 22%. And because of that, the reliance on petrol and diesel taxes went up from 25% to 35% as a share of the central government's revenue. So it doesn't have to be a carbon tax. It can be a corporate tax or some other form of tax, but we cannot take a hit to the public expenditure, right? Which is in fact creating human capital through supporting health, supporting education. There has to be some other source. And if I have just a minute, 30 seconds more, Ramya, there is a researcher, Michael Mendes from UC Irvine, who has a book called Climate Change from the Streets. And he says that for economists, a carbon tax and a cap and trade system are really two ways of implementing the same principle. But actually, it makes a very big difference on the ground. Because if you have a cap and trade system, a firm gets to decide where they reduce carbon, because one place is just as good as any other. But carbon is not the only thing that's being reduced. The other pollutants are also getting reduced, and people's lives are getting affected. Their health is getting affected. But the households, the communities whose health is either benefited or not benefited as a result of a decision that a firm makes in a cap and trade system, don't actually get a say in where that reduction happens. So yeah, so there are many different social aspects in which to discuss these trade-offs. And even in a very economic instrument like carbon tax or carbon price, there is a need to bring in more public discussion and better communication. Thanks.
Thanks, Ulka. And I do want to ask the other economist also the same question, and add the last part, to Shaun, if you can also reflect on whether a tax or a cap and trade is a better option for a developing country like India, in the sense that is it better for us to retain quantity flexibility, which a tax allows you to do in comparison to a cap and trade?
Yeah, thanks. I think Ulka has answered that question quite well. So, but I will just, so basically, the problem is that was often the tax or the subsidy is actually looked at in isolation. So, and in the example that Ulka gave, I think that was a very pertinent example that for the ICE and the EV, and I will come to that, you're trying to encourage EVs, and so you're giving a subsidy. At the same time, you're trying to discourage diesel, for example, and you're putting a tax on that. Now, but the thing is that one has to actually look at the linkages to understand how each of those policy levers impact the economy. One of the commonest things that we know is that, say, just look at the simple thing of diesel prices. The moment diesel prices increase, I mean, without even any tax or anything else, the entire economy, I mean, it's inflationary because, your even vegetables, the vegetable prices increase because trucks typically use diesel to carry stuff. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that it's difficult a priori to say that, this is better or that is better. It depends on the situation, but you have to actually look at the entire chain. You have to look at the linkages with the rest of the economy to be able to judge that. On the face of it, we normally think a tax is better than a subsidy, but then it need not be the case. And also that, I think it's relevant for your last question as well. So it depends. I mean, and I think in many of these situations, we think that, I mean, we need to know more. We need to have more data to be actually on the ground to assess the impact. So one way to do it is that you can actually have a pilot and see how the linkages are and the chains that you may have overlooked while you were imposing the tax, and see how it is working its way out throughout the economy, and then decide that, okay, this pilot was not, it's not a good idea and you need to tweak it, and you can then tweak it accordingly. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. So that brings me to the end of my questions, but we do have a bunch of questions from the audience in the Q&A. So there's one for Dr. Mathur. So is there a plan to have an intermodal scenario exercise for the models based for India, say initiated by Niti Aayog?
So, I mean, within the ICMF, we are providing a platform for taking up studies through different task forces, and at different points in time, groups of studies would be initiated under that, including intermodal comparisons from time to time. So I guess that might happen. And we've done in the past under this platform, there have been intermodal comparison exercises done as well.
And I think the next question also you can take. Data is another area of concern. For a realistic modeling, detailed information or data is required. Is it possible to have an open data portal where any researcher, energy modeler can access high resolution data even from subnational or regional levels?
So again, I mean, data is extremely important, and I mean, data gaps do exist, and some sectors really need good data to come by. Again, at Niti Aayog, we have the ICED, the India Climate Energy Database, which a portal which we are working on, which again would provide bringing together a lot of data which centers around energy and climate. So yeah, definitely, I mean, data transparency and data availability is a big issue and a big concern which we are trying to address as well.
Thank you. I think this question, maybe Kaveri, if you want to take it. What makes a model more robust than the other? Also, how are issues of equity incorporated into a model, especially those questions of equity which may not be visible at the aggregate level? For instance, historically, most of the harvesting and windowing of millets is done through backbreaking labor of women, which raises concerns about scaling millets cultivation or other such specific socio-cultural linkages between labor and industry.
Yeah, so there are two very different questions. Okay, so for what makes a model robust, and there are two aspects to this. You make a model robust versus make the model's insights robust to a policy question. So there are two different things. Making a model robust is about how well it corresponds to the system that you'd like to study, right? Making a model's policy recommendations of the policy robust is to design the experiments with the model and the way the model is used to ensure that the question that is of interest is answered. And so that's where, what uncertainties you account for, who has been involved in even commissioning the model and designing the model scenarios. All of those questions come into play. Whose uncertainties are you accounting for, and so on. So those are two different levels. And one way that if you're talking about just model robustness, there are a few ways that I can think of. One is historical validation. Has your model been able to reproduce some outputs that you've seen historically, which is, which doesn't help you say that this is what is going to happen in the future, but it still gives you more confidence that this has happened, this works under some conditions. The other way is just to expert validation. You can ask various experts whether the model that you've modeled is, how well does it correspond to their idea of the system, right? What their understanding of how a subsidy would impact behavior, how tax would impact behavior. Is there something that's not being considered? And then being very transparent about these conversations, right? So often modeling studies say this model has been peer reviewed, but you don't know what has happened in that peer review, what sort of questions have been asked and answered, right? So those are some. The other one is to say, okay, let's use two very different types of methods to tackle the same question. Let's say, which is what your inter-model comparison would also help you do, right? Like put this similar assumption, same question, but try using very different models, very different methods to answer the same question. That may allow you to get at I mean, it does help you get at different if you use different methods and get the same result, it builds much more confidence in the results. So those are some techniques which you can use to improve model robustness. The second question about equity, and I think I actually, I might have a controversial opinion on this, but I don't think our models account for equity at all in any meaningful way. Equity, especially in the domestic context, because the same questions that come at the international context also happen in the domestic context. People who are producing or using the most energy are the least contribute the most to climate change, but are least affected by the impacts of climate change. We sitting in our air-conditioned rooms are not the ones who are doing, who are affected by the heat waves. We're much more protected by risk of crop losses. Our livelihoods are not dependent on the impacts of climate change, but we're very much contributing to climate change. So I think, and inter-regional equity as well. I feel like most of our models are addressing, national level questions, but what would a Jharkhand do in terms of its economy if we transitioned entirely away from coal? Do we need more equity? So the kinds of questions that we need answering within our country need a very different scale of modeling, very different kinds of data for modeling. We need to go into the state level or the taluk level or the district level, and that requires different kinds of data. And you can think about not just distributional equity. What do we even consider justice, right? We all use a utilitarian framework by default, but there are other theories of justice where maybe we should think about helping the poorest the most, instead of like this undifferentiated idea of benefit. So I think there's lots of we as a community need to do much more work in equity, this distributional equity, this procedural equity as well. How much do our policy designs account for viewpoints of people who are most affected by them? So yeah, so I guess lots of work to be done for all of us. Exciting times.
Yeah, So if anybody else in the panel wants to add to that, and also there's another question on equity. While models have focused on the equity aspects of carbon budgets across countries, there's been little focus on equity aspects within the country. And like Kaveri was saying, regional variations. How do we make sure that there is a sufficient carbon budget left for the poor in the country? Can we, for example, have demand shifts, especially focusing on the well-off?
If I may request, I'm very interested in hearing Ulka's thoughts on this, because I thought she mentioned that there is they're working on an analysis which looks at impacts across income deciles of climate mitigation policies. So that might be
yeah, no, that's very much work in progress. We're working with another researcher and trying to combine some of the outputs from these from the green economy model, which is a systems dynamics model that tries to model these scenarios of net zero 2070, and combine it with data from national sample survey type of about jobs and wages and gendered share in labor force and all of that, and trying to look at. So, but it's very much work in progress. But the idea, I mean, the point is exactly right, Kaveri, what you said, which is our existing models don't actually allow us to look at this. We either have to build new models or have to look at methods that combine outputs of one model with another type of, in this case, a regression analysis. But this question about can we, for example, have demand shifts, especially focusing on the well-off. I'm afraid I'm one of those economists, where they say if you have a hammer, then everything in the world looks like a nail. So I'll come back to, in fact, even something like a carbon tax can definitely be a useful instrument for taxing the excessive consumption of the affluent. I mean, why could you not have a greater carbon taxation on business class travel or any kind of air travel for that matter? And there are many other ways in which you could have a progressive rather than a regressive impact. And it goes back, Ramya, to your question about the recycling the revenue, right? But even the way that things are designed can be done in a way that it hits harder at the higher levels of consumption and the type of fuel than it does at. So yeah, sorry, not a very good answer. Shawan, maybe you have a better answer on this.
Yeah. No, I think I'd only add the spatial aspect of it that was referred to, and I mean, in fact, to Kaveri's question that if Jharkhand has to sort of transition, what would it mean? Why only Jharkhand? I mean, it would be also Chhattisgarh and the other coal-producing states. But I think Jharkhand is in fact very active on this, and they've just had I think consultation yesterday on the net zero approach. And so basically, I mean, we were actually looking at 2 states, and in order to see that what would coal transition actually entail. So you're not only talking about jobs, you're talking about revenue lost. You're talking about switching to renewables. And then the thing is that suppose you have to switch from, coal is not only a primary, source of energy, it's also used as energy in industries. So basically, suppose industries had to shift from using coal to other alternatives, then those alternatives also have to be available reasonably nearby. I mean, so basically then for these states, what would it mean in terms of renewable deployment? Because there's a spatial dimension of the renewable deployment as well. At least for solar, it seems to be located on the western part of the country, whereas the coal states are actually on the eastern part of the country. But then I think it really boils down to there are so many of these issues and so many problems. And the equity problem, for example, I think it's a really, really complicated issue. And, I think, and there are no simple solutions, frankly. I mean, one would have to have conversations at several levels and at several forums to bring to leave no one behind when you are making this transition. It's not going to be an easy one, definitely.
Shawan, if you could also answer this, the other question on GDP. So there's a question on if the fundamentals of circular economy and hope for GDP growth are conflicting and hence influence policy changes. And also, in with respect to India's mission life, and is it conflicting with GDP growth?
No, I don't think it is conflicting because, the principles of circular economy are basically to make it more sustainable. It's not that simple, and it means that if you take a simple value chain, it means that each process in the value chain has to be made more sustainable. And it's not so simple to do that. I mean, we are again very preliminary looking at the textile value chain to look at how to make it circular. It's not that simple because it means changes in processes at every level. But whether it is conflicting with the GDP growth or growing sustainably, I don't think it is conflicting at all. But we have to find that way. I don't think we have the answers yet, but we have to find those ways. I mean, the basic point is that how can we grow in a more sustainable and a resilient way? That's the question. But the answer is, of course, not simple. Was there something else also?
Yeah, that there are a few more questions coming in. So to what extent would center-state relations, institutions in the energy system, and domestic politics affect India's net zero transition, and how do existing models take these into account? Does anyone want to take this?
That's a difficult one, but I mean, I would only say that, we've been talking about the need for models of different kinds. And I think here again, looking at state level modeling, district level modeling, and integrating the state level work with the national level work and so on. I think these are all requirements to be able to get to these not so easy questions to answer. So I think we don't have a clear answer, but yeah, I think these frameworks need to evolve, data needs to evolve.
And I think this is an interesting question. Maybe, I mean, I don't want to volunteer you, but I'm just, because you talked about this, it came up quite often that public discussion should play an important role in formulating policies, because most of the people are unaware of the forums where they can articulate their concerns, and in a somewhat similar vein, they're unable to quantify the costs of pursuing different net zero approaches. Is something being done by the government to counter that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I obviously can't answer on behalf of the government, but I very much appreciate the spirit in which this question has been asked, which is how do we, in some sense, make decisions on behalf of the next generation almost, without even having a widespread appreciation of what we might be giving up, for these decisions that are being made, and what was the cost of delay also. On the other hand, what if we do, let something, thinking 2070 is long ago, but what's the cost of delay to our generation and to the next? So I fully appreciate the thought behind this question. But I'm afraid, again, there is no, all this requires is a lot of detailed discussion at a very in a very grounded manner. I mean, just to give an example, not necessarily to call it a silver bullet or anything, but this Tamil Nadu district missions, right? So every district, if you create now a climate change mission and you make someone a climate change officer, obviously there will be some discussion about what does this mean for that district. This person who is in that role will make it their job to educate themselves and to keep themselves up to date and be able to communicate the implications, and will have to, in their day-to-day functioning, bring in these longer-term considerations of climate extreme events or resource scarcity, which perhaps earlier they were not mandated to do. So more and more discussion in the mainstream media in regional languages. Just yesterday, I happened to be in Patna, where we were having a discussion hosted by the Bihar State Pollution Control Board, where the Principal Secretary Environment was there, on what happened at COP27, because we all speak in such jargon-rich language that it's not easy finally to boil it down to what does it mean for the state of Bihar. So I think we just need more discussion. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone who's asking these questions can bring up these issues, not just in the form of modeling insights, but in the form of, say, thought-provoking comics, for instance. Rohan Chakravarti, who has a regular column called Green Humor, is doing this in a very effective way. Videos that are being made, so certainly I think the more information that we can provide that illuminate some of these choices and trade-offs, the better the discussion can be. I realize I sound very optimistic sometimes, and it is not easy for the community or the person living in a rural area today to actually even make choices, even if they have all this information. Their choices are very limited by what is happening at different scales. So again, there is no substitute for empowering the local governance institutions and actually ensuring room for participatory processes. Yeah, thanks.
And are there any other closing remarks from anybody else here?
Maybe I'd like to thank you, Ramya, and the team at CSTEP. I think what we were trying to do with our modeling assessments and comparison interpretation project was also figure out a way to have these discussions more, just what do we not know, what do we know, what can we do better together well. And as Dr. Mathur was also mentioning earlier, what are our complementarities. So I think so thank you very much for organizing this. I'm very happy that this is happening, and I hope we have more such events.
Thanks, Kaveri. This was a very, very interesting panel discussion as well. I have a whole bunch of notes taken and will share. So yeah, I want to thank the panel. I'd also like to thank the audience and for your questions, the climate team at CSTEP for their inputs and for helping us plan for this event. And last but not at all the least, our big thanks to the communications and IT teams, in particular. You have Regu, Preston, Sean, Merlin, Shirika, Bhavna, Ram. We couldn't have pulled this off without you guys. Thanks. And have a great evening, everyone.